Hello, my name is Jo and I'm a nurse and I'm a psychedelic nurse. And this is my friend Mush. And those of you who have ever sat in ceremony or dosing session with me will know that Mush is often with me to remind me who is really in charge. And Mush and I were wondering, do we have any other nurses in the audiences this evening? Wow, that is brilliant. It's kind of ruining my talk a bit because but I'm very happy to see you and please find me afterwards. But yes, I'm surprised there's actually so many because unfortunately, nurses are hugely underrepresented in the UK psychedelic discourse at the moment. And I think that's a terrible shame because the skills, the values, and the practices of nursing, I think they have so much to offer in the psychedelic space. So I'm here to tell you that nurses and nursing is great. But I guess some of you already know that. Nurses being consistently rated as the most trusted profession year on year in countless polls. And anyone who has ever encountered a nurse will know the difference that a good or a bad nurse can make to your experience of care. Such as the cool, vindictive, and terrifying Nurse Ratched from the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who uses her body language, her words, and the guise of doing her work and so-called therapy to terrorise the vulnerable patients in her care. Or in contrast, we have the wonderful Florence Nightingale, founder of modern-day nursing, statistician, inventor of the pie chart, and social reformer, also known as the Lady with a Lamp. She was a beacon of light and must have been a most welcome sight to the soldiers during the Crimean War. Florence transformed nursing and healthcare within the UK and beyond, and was an advocate for patient-centred care and professionalism. Okay, so here's me with some of my favourite nurses that I know and love. So I started my professional nurse training nearly 30 years ago. But before that, I was taught exceptional values of nursing, dignity and service by the Daughters of Charity as a nursing assistant in a home for young women with chronic neurological disorders. The levels of care here were simply exceptional. And you can imagine the surprise of my best friend Nikki, here seen on the left, when Sister Anne Redmond waved us off and we went off to start our nurse training in the NHS. And we realised that we were dealing with a different beast. But nevertheless, we took those skills and experiences with us and they informed our career since then. And since then, I've worked across many different settings and more recently within the psychedelic space in clinical trials and in ceremonial contexts. I started to direct my attention to psychedelic work following my own experience of I don't know how to describe it, but a really profound experience, which was a massive kind of catalyst for change. And it was a well-held legal retreat centre in Holland. And it took me a while to realise that through nursing, I potentially already had many skills, experiences and training that were directly transferable to psychedelic space holding. And it now makes me smile and to feel quite proud to think about how I tentatively approached my first sits with my friends and family. And these were people who already had experience with these medicines. They were going to do it with or without my help and my support. But I used to write lists to my psychedelic mentor, write all these lists about why it would be okay for me to do this. So fast forward a few years, and of course, it makes perfect sense to me that nurses may be well placed to support and inform this work. You only need to observe a nurse tending to a patient in a psychiatric ward or in an intensive care unit to see that space holding is really just what nurses do. And we're used to holding space for people in varying states of consciousness, and we've been doing it for eons. The spaces that nurses hold within hospitals and nursing homes and the like are particularly special as they're never ending. Staff and patients come and go, but there's a continuity of care and expectation that is handed over every 8 hours or so. Much of nursing is in the moment, and we must respond rapidly to change. No 2 days are the same, and nurses never know what challenges they're going to be called to face. By the time nurses have finished our training, we have worked with hundreds, if not thousands of people. We have witnessed and supported births, deaths, and countless health-related events in between. We've continually assessed, planned, risk assessed, coordinated and delivered complex interventions. We've given good news, bad news to patients and their families. We've managed expectations, translated complicated ideas into more manageable language, instilled hope and given counsel where there is none. And of course, we have always worked with the rituals and practices of nursing and administrative medicine. Nursing care can be very intimate, and most nurses are highly skilled at handling the body, and experiences that, if not handled sensitively, can cause patients lots of shame. Nursing is often very physical, and we use our hearts, our minds, and our bodies to be in service to our patients. And it's easy to see how these skills could be useful within a psychedelic setting. So Mary Marusic and Andrew Penn, psychedelic nurse practitioners in the United States, use the analogy of the Swiss Army knife to describe the versatility of nurses within the psychedelic space. Building on this notion of flexibility, I resonate with William Shakespeare's expression, "A jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one," which was meant as a compliment. The diverse experiences and trainings of nurses makes them well placed to deliver truly person-centred care that is not wedded to a particular school of thought. And such approaches can be especially useful when we're working with marginalised groups, many of whom are rightly suspicious of therapy and organisations. And as a mental health nurse, I'm well aware of the terrible things that have been done to patients in the not too distant past of psychiatry and research. And despite my various trainings, I continually find myself coming back to the skills, practices and values of nursing as the approach that is most likely to induce trust and feelings of trust and safety for my participants, and the least likely to cause harm. I feel that nursing can be an innocuous approach to psychedelic support, and when done skillfully, is likely to be well received by most. And some of you may have heard of the idea of psychedelic process and sitting being a bit like midwife in the soul. And of course, midwives are nurses. The act of nursing, when done well, can be a work of exquisite beauty and accomplishment that is in no way passive. As with good psychedelic space holding, the most competent of our profession often make it look easy and of no bother to the patient. But this is not to deny the skill and expertise in making it look so. So I am not arguing that nurses are best placed or are the only discipline to support psychedelic work, and I've got no desire to work in a team that consists primarily of nurses. I instead argue for a flexible psychedelic workforce, and by workforce I mean anyone who works in a psychedelic space in whatever setting. In fact, I'm deeply concerned that the idea that a particular profession or school of thought could be put forward as best place to support these mysterious experiences. You may have heard of the parable of the blind men and the elephant, where a group of blind men come across an elephant for the first time, each feeling and describing only their part. In some versions of the story, they come to blows and suspect that each is being dishonest. The moral of the story is that humans have the tendency to claim absolute truth based on their limited experience and ignore or devalue the experience of others, which could be equally true. And one of the best and most effective teams that I ever worked in was called the Children's Trust during the days of a Labour government. Here we had funding and the seemingly radical idea of providing early intervention services to children and families before their problems got too serious and entrenched. As one of the first primary mental health workers, I worked in partnership with a large multidisciplinary team, which included many disciplines from health, social care and education, and the jewel in the crown was a police officer. Within this team, it was possible to coordinate multi-agency assessments and interventions that could link, say, a child's poor school attendance, mental health problems or behavioural problems with a history of domestic violence in the home, vastly expanding the understanding of the child, their issues, their environment, and thus informing the most appropriate responses. Unsurprisingly, this approach was very effective, and diversity within this workforce led to many things, such as creative approaches, cross-fertilisation of skills, efficiency savings, and high levels of morale within the team. My own practice has been greatly enhanced with an ongoing, deep mentorship relationship with someone who does not have a medical background, but is very knowledgeable about psychedelic experience, psychedelic history and culture, and non-clinical approaches to this work. I'm excited by the prospect of creating hybrid models that span different schools of thought and experience. Indeed, I feel that many of the issues that I've seen in various psychedelic spaces can be traced back to the inability of facilitators to look and work outside of their primary lens. At its essence, to nurse is to care, and the values and skills of nursing are not exclusive to the nursing profession. Humanity would not have survived if we had not been able to utilise these skills for ourselves, for our families and our communities. Anyone who's nursed a sick child, a friend, relative, pet or themselves knows this to be true. And of course, most people who are seeking psychedelic experiences are not unwell, and yet they may still benefit from the loving care of a guide, friend or loved one. Many space holders and sitters and solo journeyers could profit from becoming more acquainted with some basic ideas of nursing, and I suggest that the care and safety of the body should be the very least that anybody who's facilitating a psychedelic session or planning their own should commit to. And I must just say, so on the right here, this is my friend Dennis, who should be in the audience today. He's a lovely social worker, and he couldn't join us. His son Felix, on the day that I was looking for slides to illustrate my point, became ill, and he sent me the slide, but poor Dennis is ill, so he can't be here today. But thank you to Dennis and Felix. So, I'd like to introduce you to another hero of nursing, Mary Seacole. Mary, known as Mother to Many, was a Jamaican Scot nurse, doctress and entrepreneur. Mary was so determined to take care to where it was needed that she funded her own travel and practice on the front line of the Crimean War. She'd often ride her horse onto the battlefield to deliver care and food to the weary soldiers. Mary faced many challenges during her life, including racism, financial struggles and ill health. In addition to exemplary nursing skills, in Mary's autobiography, the first to be written by a Black woman in Britain, Mary describes her recognition of the profound medicine of hospitality. Her accounts of how she welcomed people into her hotel and the delight she managed to feed them in an environment of scarcity and the constant threat of theft and violence are truly inspiring. Many soldiers were too scared to go to hospital, but they would go to Mary's hotel and receive care there. I believe that the art of hospitality is something that is often neglected by space holders, and space holders could recognise and nurture this as part of the wider medicine of this work. As a guide on the clinical trials, I've been pleasantly surprised at how it's possible to create good experiences with obvious restrictions in terms of set and setting. That said, it's felt very difficult for me to send off a participant at the end of the day, knowing that so much of what seems innately therapeutic within a naturalistic setting happens outside of any dosing session, around the kitchen table, or around the fire, or during walks, and so on. After all, these experiences are not just pharmacological interventions, and they have the potential to be so much more than the ingestion of taking a drug, the experience of taking a drug. Of course. So some people question, do we even need a trip sitter? And we could also ask ourselves if some of our participants would actually be better off without us. However, assuming we would prefer one, it can be useful to reflect on what has seemed helpful or not during our own psychedelic experiences. So during a recent experience as a participant on a psychedelic trial, where let's just say it was expected that it would be one of the more intense hours of my life, I was comforted to know that others would be caring for my body when it was very likely that I'd have the experience of not having one. And in fact, I found the frequent blood draws and the sense that business was going on around me quite reassuring. And during other experiences in more naturalistic settings, I have found great comfort in looking up and seeing the confident, dare I say, loving gaze of experienced facilitators. And it would be crass to suggest that all you need to do is sit up front and smile. But rather that often those smiles convey years of experience and a high level of competence and confidence in the work. To me, so much of facilitation seems about finding that sweet spot between enough and yet not too much intervention. And that can only really come from experience. As a nurse, I consider myself to be part of a lineage of nursing that can be traced back to the likes of Florence, Mary, and beyond. And in fact, all nurses are trained for a process of practical experiences that are housed within the metaphorical bosom of other nurses. I'm deeply inspired by the work of Florence Nightingale, and I like to consider myself to be in relationship to her, in particular through her work, Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not, written in 1859, which I believe still has resonance today. Much of what Florence believed about nursing and nurse training could be applied to the psychedelic space and the training of space holders. A systems thinker, Florence did not feel that the answer to the health issues of the nation was to simply train more professionals and build more hospitals. Instead, she appealed to all those with responsibility for caregiving to familiarise themselves with the foundational values and practices of nursing, and to look to their environments, to look for the causes of ill health, such as poor hygiene and lack of ventilation. If Florence were to be involved with this so-called psychedelic renaissance, I suspect she would be just as concerned with skilling up the public and community leaders as well as training so-called experts. Florence believed that ultimately it was nature that healed, and that good nursing was not about administering medicines and applying dressings, but it was in fact a process of removing the barriers to health and restoration. Florence spoke extensively about issues of setting within healing environments, imploring that we don't treat the conditions within such spaces as inevitable, like the weather. She spoke about issues that she thought were important, and like the proper use of air, light, warmth, quiet, music, clothing, nutrition, novelty, aesthetics, communication, management, and boundaries. Like many at this conference, I'm deeply concerned with how best to support people who are interested in doing psychedelic work. Florence believed that nursing should be a vocation, not just a profession. She said this was in part because the work involves being so intimately involved with the lives of others, and it's more likely to be effective if there was a calling, an innate calling to do it. Florence believed that she was called by God to nurse and to be of service to man, and that her relationship with God was the motivation for her to nurse. So just in case you're wondering, I feel very strongly that a call to do medicine work received in the process of taking said medicine needs to be held very lightly and subjected to a thorough integration process. I really try to practice being in service to the medicines and to my participants, hence my special relationship with Mush. I feel it helps to keep me in check and to try to address some of the potential power imbalances in care. Psychedelics are often boundary dissolving, and issues around ethics require an even greater consideration than most of us are used to. Florence believed that the best nurses have the essential qualifications before they go to school. I feel this is particularly important for anyone who's drawn to this work, particularly if they don't already possess a background in care or service, to think very carefully about their how and their why. There are a myriad ways to support psychedelic work and culture, and as I've heard Darren Springer say, it's important to get in where you fit in. In terms of training, Florence felt that people learn best through experience, and I agree. And I think we should be deeply suspicious of any training that claims to get you ready via an online course without lots of practical experience and mentorship. Whilst recognising this is difficult to achieve within the confines of the law, it is my opinion that psychedelic guides should have their own, preferably extensive psychedelic experience. There is a real risk that in our eagerness to become involved in this work, that we are tempted to work outside of our scope of experience. And one of my rules for myself is that if I couldn't work with somebody without the medicine, I won't work with them with it. Florence spoke about the importance of meticulous observation, and she felt this was the most important skill to teach any nursing student. She suggested that almost all superstitions are owing to bad observation. She recognised the difference between one nurse who appears to have a peculiar power over her patient and another who doesn't is nothing but minute observation in the first and the lack of it in the second. Florence implored somebody to be in charge in any caregiving situation, saying that that person should also make sure that in their absence that things are done as they would have done. And of course, nurses are very used to this. Adequate management seems particularly important when there appears to be a direct correlation between a participant's feelings of trust and safety and their ability to meet highly charged emotional and physical experience and memories that can be quite terrifying and also have the potential to add to their trauma history instead of helping it. Participants and co-facilitators are often greatly reassured when they see that somebody is taking charge, holding the boundaries and responding to any untoward events. And as my mentor says, somebody also needs to decide when we're going to open the curtains. Florence urged that we should no longer hear of mysterious dispensations of plague and pestilence as being in God's hands when, as far as we know, they are in ours. And I feel this is particularly relevant where situations that could be explained by bad setting, inadequate processes, or the inexperience of the guides can be projected into the dynamics of the participants or blamed on external forces like the alignment of the stars. I'm not saying such issues haven't got relevance, but putting too much weight on one possibility arguably prevents our ability to take responsibility, make amends and improvements for the future. Florence recognised how cruel mistakes were sometimes made by benevolent men in matters of business which they can know nothing and think that they know a great deal. It's imperative that all space holders have access to supervisory relationships where they can discuss untoward events and celebrate successes, preferably through a model of reflective practice. This seems particularly important within the emerging psychedelic field, but in many ways we are all learning. And of course, what we do and don't do now really matters, not least because many of the delegates in this very room and at the wider conference have experienced how our own lives and those of our loved ones and some of the most vulnerable people in society have been seemingly positively affected by these powerful experiences. So it's important that we must push forward while simultaneously staying grounded and tread carefully and skillfully and within the scopes of our experience, for fear that we jeopardise the safety of those in our care and derail the psychedelic renaissance. So to reflect, nursing and nurses are pretty cool. And I think we could think more about it within the various psychedelic settings that we find ourselves. So one last thing before I go, and I've been waiting to do this for ages, but I haven't had a suitable audience, and you look great. So I'd be absolutely honoured if you would witness me taking an amended version of the Nightingale Pledge, which is currently said by qualified nurses in North America. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to take my copy of Notes of Nursing, and this is the real mush. It's been to Guatemala, it's been all over the place. Okay, so maybe those of you who have ever had a well-supported psychedelic experience can bring your space holders to mind now. And if not, maybe you can think of an experience where you've received good nursing care, be that from a nurse or an allied professional or anybody for that matter. Bringing those people to mind, taking a moment to connect to that experience, feeling gratitude for this and for humans' immense capacity to care for one another. The Nightingale Pledge. I solemnly pledge myself before Mush and in the presence of this assembly to pass my working life in purity and to practice my profession faithfully. I will abstain from whatever is damaging, and I will not take or administer any harmful medicine. I will do all in my power to maintain and elevate my profession, and will hold in confidence all personal matters committed to my keeping, and all family affairs coming to my knowledge in the practice of my calling. With loyalty, I will endeavour to be of service and aid the medicine in its work, and devote myself to the welfare of those committed to my care. Thank you.